The first thing Derek Musgrove noticed was the smell. Not the usual scent of fresh flowers his staff arranged every morning. Not the warm cedar and leather of a home that cost $43 million to build. This was something else. Something cold and clinical. Like a hospital corridor dressed up in expensive cologne. He hadn't told anyone he was coming back. No call to the estate manager. No text to the head of security. He had left a board meeting in Chicago 3 days early, driven straight to the private airstrip, and landed back in Atlanta before noon. He wanted quiet. He wanted his own bed. He wanted, just for one afternoon, to feel like a man who actually lived in his own home. Derek punched in the gate code himself, waved off the guard, and walked up the long driveway alone. The yard was immaculate, under the hedges trimmed to the inch. His armored SUV sat gleaming in its usual spot near the fountain, engine cool. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for the silence. A property with 14 staff members was never this quiet. He was still reaching for his house keys when something slammed into him from the left. Hard, fast. A force that drove the air clean out of his lungs and spun him off the stone path entirely. His briefcase hit the ground. His shoulders struck the side of the SUV. Before he could shout, before he could even process what was happening, a hand clamped over his mouth, firm, urgent, yellow rubber still damp from cleaning solution. He was on the ground. The cold asphalt pressing through the fabric of a suit that cost more than most people's cars. The chassis of his own vehicle inches above his face, and the smell of engine oil thick in his throat. "Mr. Musgrove, please." He recognized the voice immediately. Caitlyn, his maid. 3 years on the estate, and he wasn't entirely sure he'd ever said her name directly to her face. She was somewhere in his peripheral vision, always. A white apron, yellow gloves, quiet footsteps. Background. She was not background now. Her eyes were locked on his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Her whole body was trembling, but her hand never moved from his mouth. She pressed one finger to her lips with her free hand, shaking her head slowly, deliberately. "Don't." Derek heard footsteps on the stone path above them. Slow, unhurried, confident. He turned his head a fraction of an inch. Through the narrow gap between the tire and the ground, he could see them. 2 pairs of shoes. One, polished heels, the kind Beth wore to charity events. The other, Italian leather Oxfords he'd bought his brother Richard as a birthday gift 2 years ago. They had stopped walking. They were standing less than 10 feet away. Derek's first instinct was relief. Beth was here. Richard was here. He could stand up, brush off his jacket, turn this into a story they'd laugh about at dinner. "You should have seen me on the ground." Then he heard what they were saying. Tonight, after the gala. The doctor already confirmed it. At the current level, his heart simply stops. No signs, nothing suspicious. Beth's voice, calm, conversational, the same tone she used to discuss seating arrangements. Richard laughed softly. "And you're certain the morning dose was doubled?" "I did it myself." Derek felt the ground tilt beneath him. The dizziness these past 3 weeks. The mornings where he'd needed 2 cups of coffee just to feel human. The chest tightness his cardiologist had called stress-related. The bitter aftertaste he'd noticed in his green juice and mentioned to no one because men like Derek Musgrove did not complain about juice. His legs went cold. Above him, Beth straightened Richard's collar. He could see her fingers through the gap. Familiar fingers. A diamond he had placed on her hand himself. "The staff? They see nothing," she said. "They never do." The footsteps resumed, moving toward the house, getting quieter. Derek realized he hadn't breathed in 30 seconds. Caitlyn slowly pulled her hand from his mouth. She leaned close enough that her voice was barely a vibration of air. "They've been doing it for 6 weeks, she whispered. "I saw her, in the kitchen, before you were awake. I didn't know what to do. I didn't think anyone would believe me. But then I called the lab and She stopped, swallowed. "Mr. Musgrove, if you go inside that house tonight, you won't come back out." Derek looked at her. This woman he had passed every single day. who had ironed his shirts and cleaned his study and probably knew the layout of his home better than he did, whose name he had never once said at a dinner party, whose face he wouldn't have been able to describe to a sketch artist 48 hours ago. She had known. She had known for 6 weeks, and she had stayed. And right now, lying in the oil and the gravel beneath 40 tons of luxury and betrayal, Derek Musgrove understood something that all his money had never once taught him. The most dangerous room in the world was the one people assumed you were safe in, and the only person standing between him and a quiet, invisible death was the woman everyone else looked straight through. But what Derek didn't know yet, what Caitlyn hadn't told him, was why she had really stayed. And that reason was going to change everything. If you want to know what Caitlyn discovered in that kitchen 6 weeks ago, and why she risked everything to save a man who never once looked her in the eye, follow this page and turn on notifications. The next part drops tomorrow, soon. And trust me, the reason she stayed is not what you think. Comment Caitlyn below if you want Chapter 1. Let's see if this story deserves to be told. Derek had complained about the juice exactly once. 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday, standing at the kitchen island in his robe while the city was still dark outside. He had taken one sip, set the glass down and said, to no one in particular, to the air, to the general machinery of the house, "This tastes off." Caitlyn had been behind him, wiping the counter. He hadn't looked at her when he said it. He hadn't expected an answer. He was already scrolling his phone, already somewhere else, already gone. Beth had come downstairs 20 minutes later, kissed him on the cheek, and handed him the glass back. "You've been working too hard," she'd said. "You're tasting stress." He had finished the juice. Now, lying on the cold asphalt with grease on his jacket and the sound of his wife's footsteps fading toward the front door, Derek replayed that Tuesday morning the way you replay a car crash, frame by frame, looking for the moment you could have turned the wheel. He thought about the morning after that, when he'd woken up with his hands shaking so badly he'd dropped his phone twice before his feet hit the floor. His doctor had called it fatigue, suggested magnesium, recommended less travel. He thought about the Thursday he'd had to pull over on the highway because the edges of his vision had gone white and strange. And he'd sat in the emergency lane of I-285 for 11 minutes, telling himself it was nothing. It was stress. It was the altitude from the Chicago flight. He thought about last Friday, standing at the head of a conference table with 17 people watching him, when the words he had meant to say simply didn't come. Just a gap. A blank space where language used to live. His CFO had covered for him without being asked. Everyone had pretended not to notice. He had been so certain it was exhaustion, because that was the story that made sense for a man like him. A man who slept 4 hours and ran 3 companies and ate at his desk and treated his own body like rented equipment. Of course he was burning out. Of course. But Beth had known the real story. Beth had stood at that kitchen island with a glass of green juice and a hand on his chest and looked him directly in the eye. And she had known that the bitterness he tasted was not stress. It had a name, a dosage, a timeline. And tonight was apparently the end of it. Derek pressed his palm flat against the asphalt and felt the cold move up through his arm. $43 million of property surrounding him in every direction. Security cameras he had paid for. Guards he had hired. A doctor on retainer who had seen him 6 times in the past month and noticed nothing. Everything he owned. And none of it had seen what Caitlyn saw. Caitlyn was already moving. She pressed her body lower against the asphalt and pulled Derek's sleeve, not asking, pulling, guiding him inch by inch toward the rear of the SUV, where the shadow was deepest and the angle of the security camera couldn't reach. She knew exactly where the blind spot was. Derek realized, with a hollowness that had nothing to do with poison, that he had never once thought about where the blind spots were in his own home. She had, because that was her world. The undersides of things, the corners, the spaces between what people saw and what was actually there. He watched her hands as they moved, those yellow rubber gloves, still on, still faintly damp, and something small and uncomfortable shifted in his chest. He had seen those gloves every single day for 3 years, and they were as much a fixture of his estate as the fountain or the iron gate. And yet, if someone had asked him this morning, "What color are your maid's gloves?" he would have drawn a complete blank. He hadn't seen them. He had seen through her, the way you see through a window, aware of the glass only when it's dirty. There is a term for what Caitlyn had been doing inside that house for 3 years. Researchers call it invisible labor. The essential, unglamorous work that keeps a system functioning, performed by people the system is designed not to notice. The cooking, the cleaning, the organizing, the quiet, anticipatory thinking that means your towel is always warm and your coffee is always ready, and your world runs without friction. It doesn't appear on any balance sheet. It rarely appears in anyone's memory. But here was the thing about invisible labor that Derek was only now beginning to understand. Pressed against the cold ground with grease on his collar and a dead man's timeline in his bloodstream. Invisible didn't mean unaware. It meant unseen. Caitlyn had been watching his household with the careful, practiced attention of someone whose job required her to notice everything. Because missing a detail meant making a mistake, and making a mistake meant consequences. She had noticed the green juice. She had noticed Beth's hands on the blender before sunrise. She had noticed the tiny brown bottle that disappeared into a robe pocket before anyone else came downstairs. She had noticed all of it, and not one person in that house had noticed her noticing. Derek looked at her now, really looked, and maybe for the first time, and saw someone who had been paying attention inside his life long after he had stopped paying attention to hers. Now pause for a second. Look at the image at the top of this story. Look at Caitlyn's hands. If you were Derek, honestly, would you have ever noticed the color of those gloves before this moment? Think about who in your life might already be seeing everything, while you see nothing at all. They moved through the service gate on foot. Caitlyn had known the code, of course she had, and she'd punched it in without hesitating, keeping her body low and her eyes on the tree line that bordered the estate's eastern edge. Derek followed, because there was nothing else to do, because every other option ended with him walking back through that front door. She hadn't spoken since they cleared the camera range. She was moving with a purpose that told him she had already thought several steps ahead, and the only thing he needed to contribute right now was silence and speed. He managed both. They were 4 blocks from the estate, cutting through the alley behind a row of industrial units, when she stopped walking and turned to face him. No preamble, no softening. "Give me the watch." Derek looked at his wrist. The Patek Philippe, a platinum case, meteorite dial, bought at auction for $1.2 million. He had worn it so long, it felt like skin. "Caitlyn." "It has a GPS module," she said. "Standard on that model. Beth's security team will already be tracking it if they've noticed you're not inside." She held out her yellow-gloved hand, patient, immovable. The watch and the phone. He stood there for 2 full seconds, a billionaire being asked to hand his possessions to his maid in an alley behind a scrapyard, and felt the absurdity of it press against something deep and stubborn inside him. The part that had survived boardrooms and hostile takeovers and men twice his size trying to take things from him. Then he thought about Beth's voice through the gap under the car. "I doubled the dose this morning." He unclasped the watch. Caitlyn took it without ceremony and walked 10 feet to a rusted industrial bin, overflowing with scrap metal, coiled wire, broken brackets, the skeletal remains of machinery that had outlived its purpose. She dropped the watch in. It disappeared into the rust without a sound. Phone. He unlocked it out of habit, then caught himself. Habit. The automatic, unthinking behavior of a man who had never once had to consider whether his routines were being used against him. He powered it off first, then handed it over. It followed the watch into the bin. $1.2 million and a device containing the architecture of his entire empire. Gone in under 40 seconds. Derek stared at the bin for a moment, at the rust eating slowly through metal that had once been something, and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of a man who had just discovered that the things he thought made him powerful had actually made him findable. Caitlyn was already moving again. "We have maybe an hour before they realize you're not on the property," she said, not looking back. "And there's something else you need to know." She paused. "About where we're going." The house was the size of his closet, not a metaphor. Derek stood in the doorway and did the actual calculation, the unconscious, humiliating arithmetic of a man who measured square footage the way other people measured time, and landed on roughly 400 feet of space. One room, a kitchenette along the back wall, a single window with a curtain that didn't quite reach the sill. The kind of place that existed in the city's margins, invisible to people who drove through those streets without stopping. Caitlyn knew the woman who lived here. That much was clear from the way the door opened before they knocked. A small, older woman named Gloria, who looked at Caitlyn with immediate understanding and at Derek with the measured, unsentimental gaze of someone who had seen trouble arrive at her door before and had learned to assess it quickly. She let them in without a word. Derek sat on the edge of a chair that wobbled slightly and looked at the walls. A child's drawing pinned near the window, a wooden cross above the door, a shelf of mismatched dishes that were clean and carefully arranged, and tried to locate the feeling he expected to find. Vulnerability. Exposure. The specific dread of a man stripped of every layer of protection he had ever built. It wasn't there. Or rather, it was there. But it was quieter than he'd expected. Because the room, for all its smallness, was the first place since he'd pulled into his own driveway that nobody was trying to kill him. He thought about his estate. 14 staff. 20 security personnel on rotating shifts. Cameras covering every exterior angle. A panic room behind the library that he'd spent $200,000 installing and never once used. And inside all of that, inside the fortress, Beth had poisoned his juice every morning with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that the safest place to hide a crime was directly in the center of everything that was supposed to prevent one. 20 guards. Not one of them watching. There is a name for what happened inside that house. Psychologists call it the bystander effect. The phenomenon where the presence of multiple people actually reduces the likelihood that any single one of them will act. Responsibility spreads across the crowd until it belongs to no one. Everyone assumes someone else has already noticed. Everyone waits. No, Caitlyn had been the only one truly watching because she had been the only one working alone, in the quiet, before the house woke up. No crowd to dissolve into. No shared assumption of safety. Just her eyes and what they saw. It had cost her something to act on it. Derek could see that now in the way she sat. Back straight, hands folded, jaw set, carrying a weight she hadn't put down since the morning she first saw Beth at that blender. Gloria set 2 cups of tea on the table without being asked. Derek wrapped both hands around his and felt the warmth move through fingers that were still faintly trembling. Here is a question worth sitting with. Would you feel safer right now? In a mansion with 20 guards you cannot trust? Or in a 400-square-foot room with one person who has already proved she would rather risk her life than look the other way? Take your time. The answer will tell you something important about what safety actually means. Kayla arrived 18 minutes after Caitlyn made the call. She came through Gloria's back door with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the careful, unhurried energy of someone who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury the sick couldn't afford. She was a home care nurse, mid-30s, natural hair pulled back, scrubs under a winter coat. And she looked at Derek the way medical people look at problems they are already solving before they've finished assessing them. She had known Caitlyn since childhood. That was all Derek was told, and something in Caitlyn's tone made clear it was all he needed to know. "Sit forward," Kayla said, setting her bag on Gloria's small table. "And roll up your sleeve." Derek obeyed, again, on the strange new reflex of a man who had spent 30 years telling other people what to do, and watched her work with quiet efficiency. Blood pressure cuff, pulse oximeter, a small blood draw kit she assembled with the practice speed of someone who had done it 10,000 times. She didn't make small talk. The silence lasted 4 minutes. Then she looked at the preliminary strip from a portable cardiac reader she'd pulled from her bag and something in her expression shifted. Not panic. Kayla didn't do panic, but a careful, controlled tightening around the eyes that Derek recognized as the face of a professional absorbing information they wish they weren't receiving. "How long have you been symptomatic?" she asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when a number confirms something they already suspected was worse than hoped. She looked at Caitlyn. "You said she doubled it this morning?" "I saw her," Caitlyn said. "Twice the amount she's been using." Kayla set the reader down and folded her hands on the table. A gesture so deliberate that it pulled all the air out of the room. "The compound she's been using is a cardiac glycoside," she said, her voice level and precise. "At the doses you've been receiving, your heart has been operating under sustained stress for weeks. At double, your system is already in toxic range. Your body is processing it right now." She paused. "Without intervention, you are looking at cardiac arrest within 2 hours, possibly less." The wobbling chair felt suddenly very still beneath him. 2 hours. Derek had sat in rooms where billions of dollars changed hands and felt less cornered than he did right now in 400 square feet with a cup of tea going cold in front of him. He thought about the gala, the one Beth had mentioned to Richard, the one that started at 8, the one that was apparently supposed to serve as his alibi-proof timeline. She had scheduled his death around a charity event. "Can you treat it?" he asked. Kayla met his eyes. "Here, with what I have." She reached into her bag. "I can buy you time." She said it like it was a gift. Like time was something he had forgotten had a price. The knock came 40 minutes after Kayla's injection. 3 measured raps on Gloria's front door, not urgent, not aggressive. The knock of someone who already knew they had the authority to wait. Nobody moved. Caitlyn was at the window first, pulling the curtain back a single inch. Derek watched her face. That face he was learning to read now, the way you learn to read weather, and saw something he hadn't seen there before. Not fear. She had moved past fear somewhere under the SUV. This was something colder. Recognition. "It's Captain Miles," she said quietly. Derek knew the name. Miles had overseen the private security contract for the estate for 6 years. Former decorated officer. Commendations on the wall of his office. The kind of man whose physical presence, broad, uniformed, he composed, communicated safety the way an architectural column communicates permanence. Just by standing there. Just by existing in the frame. The knock came again. "Mr. Musgrove." His voice was calm through the door, almost gentle. "Sir, we received a report of a disturbance. I'm here to help. You can trust me." Derek's first instinct, the instinct of 30 years, the marrow-deep reflex of a man who had been conditioned by every visual cue society offered, was to stand up and open the door. Badge, uniform, known face, steady voice. Everything that had ever meant safe. Caitlyn's hand landed on his arm before he got to his feet. "Think," she said. The single word was not a plea. It was an instruction. And so he thought. He thought about the fact that nobody knew they were here. He had no phone, no GPS, no traceable device. And they had walked 16 blocks through back streets and alleys. And the only people aware of this address were Caitlyn, Gloria, and Kayla. He thought about how many people Beth's money could reach. He thought about what confirmation bias actually meant, not as an abstract concept, but as a mechanism. The human brain, under stress, reaches for the fastest available explanation. It finds the pattern it already recognizes and locks on. A badge looks like safety. A uniform looks like rescue. And the mind, grateful for the shortcut, stops asking the next question. How did he find us? That was the question. That was the only question that mattered right now, and it had no innocent answer. Caitlyn looked at him steadily. She had no badge, no uniform, no commendations. She had yellow rubber gloves and a wobbling chair, and 18 minutes of her own life she had spent at personal risk before Derek even understood what she was risking it for. The knock came a 3rd time. "I'm going to need you to make a decision," Caitlyn said. "Low, even. Right now." Derek looked at the door. Then he looked at her. Now you make it too. Captain Miles says he's there to save you. He has a badge, a uniform, and a voice built for trust. But Caitlyn has already proved, with her body on the asphalt, that she means what she says. Do you open the door? Or do you trust the woman who never needed a badge to show you who she was? They went back at dusk. Caitlyn's idea. The shift change between the estate's evening and night security teams created a 4-minute window. She knew this because she had watched it happen every single day for 3 years, carrying laundry or trash or cleaning supplies through corridors that the guards treated as scenery. 4 minutes where the cameras on the East Wing cycled through their reboot sequence, and the overlap between outgoing and incoming personnel meant that nobody was watching anything with full attention. 4 minutes. Derek had once spent longer than that deciding which cufflinks to wear. They came in through the service entrance. Caitlyn's key, Caitlyn's code, Caitlyn's intimate knowledge of every squeaking floorboard and motion sensor blind spot in a house Derek had designed but never truly learned. She moved through the corridor with her body close to the wall and her footsteps placed with a precision that made Derek feel large and clumsy behind her. A man-shaped liability in an expensive suit that was now streaked with asphalt and engine grease. The drive was in his study, third drawer of the mahogany desk, a small encrypted device where Derek kept recordings from his private security system, a parallel feed he'd installed 2 years ago without telling anyone, including Beth, because he had trusted her completely and still somehow felt better with a backup. The particular irony of that decision was not lost on him now. The study was dark, empty. Derek crossed the room in 8 steps, opened the drawer, found the drive exactly where he'd left it. His hand was steadier than he expected. He's some dormant version of himself, the one that had built the company from nothing, that had sat across from men who wanted to destroy him and smiled, was apparently still operational beneath the fear. He slipped the drive into his jacket pocket. That was when he heard Richard's voice in the hallway. Not far. 20 feet, maybe less. The casual, carrying confidence of a man who believed the house already belonged to him. Because in every way that had mattered for the past 6 weeks, it had. Caitlyn was beside Derek in 2 steps. She pulled him toward the narrow gap behind the floor-length curtains at the study window. The same curtains Derek had chosen himself from a catalog, barely registering them, certainly never imagining he would one day hide behind them in his own home while his brother walked the halls like a landlord. Richard's footsteps slowed outside the door. Derek stopped breathing. The door handle moved. A half turn. Testing. The door drifted open an inch, spilling a blade of hallway light across the floor that stopped 2 feet short of where they stood. A pause. Then Richard's phone rang, loud, jarring, and his footsteps retreated down the hall as he answered it. Derek let the breath out. Caitlyn's hand found his wrist in the dark, not guiding this time, just holding. A small human anchor in the middle of the lion's den. The drive was in his pocket. The gala started in 40 minutes. And whatever was on that device was either going to save them both or make everything that had happened today feel like the easy part. The gala was everything Beth had designed it to be. 300 people in black tie. Crystal chandeliers throwing warm light across a ballroom that smelled of champagne and fresh flowers and the particular variety of goodwill that costs $5,000 a plate. A charity event. Children's education, Derek noted, the specific irony landing somewhere between his ribs. With Beth at the center of it, radiant in navy silk, laughing at something a city councilman had said, her hand resting lightly on Richard's arm. They looked like the future already. Derek had borrowed a jacket from Gloria's neighbor, ill-fitting, slightly short in the sleeve, and walked through the service entrance behind Caitlyn for the second time that evening. He carried the drive in his breast pocket. Kayla had connected them 20 minutes earlier to a journalist, a woman named Diane Chen, who had been investigating financial irregularities tied to Beth's charitable foundation for 7 months, and had been waiting, she said, for something that could not be dismissed. The AV setup was in a side room off the main ballroom. A technician Diane had placed there 3 hours ago. The drive would feed directly to the presentation screen, the same screen currently displaying a slideshow of smiling children. And the audio from Derek's parallel security feed would fill the ballroom speakers with 6 weeks of recorded conversation. 6 weeks of Beth's voice. 6 weeks of a murder being planned in careful domestic language. It took 4 minutes to connect the drive. Derek stood with his back to the door and his hands steady, and his eyes on the progress bar crossing the screen, and tried not to think about the fact that his heart, his genuinely, medically compromised heart, was working harder than it should be. The feed went live. The ballroom went silent the way rooms go silent when something has happened that the brain cannot immediately categorize. Then the murmuring started. Then the shouting. Derek walked through the side door into the light and found 300 faces turning toward him. The dead man, present and breathing. And watched Beth's expression move through shock and fury and calculation in under 2 seconds. She was fast. He had always known that about her. Her hand moved to the small of her back. Derek had not known about the gun. He saw it clear the fabric, saw her arm come up, and saw the specific, terrible geometry of where it was pointing, not at him, but past him, at the slight figure in the borrowed apron standing 6 feet to his left, the only witness whose testimony could confirm everything on that recording was real. 1 second. The evidence was on the screen. The truth was in the air. 300 people were watching. And now the question is yours. A Pyrrhic victory is a win that costs so much, it hollows out the triumph entirely. The ancient King Pyrrhus defeated the Romans and lost so many of his own men that he reportedly said, "Another such victory, and I am undone." The drive is playing. The world is watching. Beth's gun is rising. You have 1 second. Do you duck and survive to testify? Or do you step in front of the only other person in that room who told the truth when it cost her everything? I'll think carefully. Because Derek had 1 second too. And what he chose next will tell you everything about who he had become since that morning on the asphalt. Derek stepped in front of her. He didn't decide to. There was no calculation, no cost-benefit assessment, no boardroom logic applied to the geometry of the moment. His body simply moved. The way bodies move when something deeper than thought is finally driving them. And the shot that Beth fired in that chandelier-bright ballroom caught him across the left shoulder instead of finding Caitlyn's chest. He went down. The room erupted. Security. Screaming. The hard, flat sound of a second gun being drawn by a plainclothes officer Diane had positioned near the stage. Beth was on the floor in seconds. Richard was already running and already caught. The recording played on above all of it. Beth's voice filling the ballroom, calm and domestic and damning. While Derek lay on the marble and watched the chandeliers blur at the edges of his vision. Caitlyn was beside him before anyone else reached him. Her hands on his face, her eyes finding his. He tried to say something and couldn't locate the words, which seemed appropriate because he had spent 30 years locating words for everything, and they had rarely said what actually needed saying. She made it to the ambulance. She was alive when they loaded her. Derek was later told, from his own hospital bed, that the shock of the shooting had triggered a reaction in her, a cardiac event that the paramedics had attributed to the sustained stress of the preceding hours. She was alive when the ambulance doors closed. She was alive for 11 minutes after that. Then she wasn't. Also, the library was exactly as he had left it. 3 weeks after the gala, Derek sat in the leather chair behind a desk that had once felt like a throne and looked at walls lined floor to ceiling with the architecture of a life built entirely on accumulation. Books he had collected for their spines. Awards he had accepted for their optics. A view of the city that had always confirmed, in glass and light, that he was above it. Beth was in custody. Richard was in custody. Captain Miles had been suspended pending a federal investigation. The company was intact. The estate was legally his. His cardiologist had cleared him, cautiously, with conditions and a follow-up schedule, and a prescription he took every morning with a glass of water he poured himself. He had won. Every measurable thing that could be recovered had been recovered. And the library, with its 40-foot ceilings and its first-edition shelves and its unobstructed view of the skyline, was the quietest and most airless place Derek Musgrove had ever sat in his life. He thought about yellow gloves. He thought about a wobbling chair and a cup of tea placed on a table without being asked. He thought about a hand on his wrist in the dark, not guiding, just holding, and the specific, irreplaceable weight of being seen by someone who had no reason to stay and stayed anyway. He thought about what it meant to spend a lifetime building an empire and only understand, at the very end, what would have made it worth something. Outside, the city moved, bright and indifferent and vast. Derek sat in his empty throne and did not move for a very long time. Caitlyn never asked to be a hero. She just refused to look away. If this story moved you, if you felt something in that library at the end, then you already understand what most people spend their whole lives missing. Hit the like button if Caitlyn deserved better. Subscribe if you believe the people we overlook are often the ones holding everything together. And drop one word in the comments, just one, that describes how this story made you feel. Because stories like this don't just entertain. They remind us to look at the people right in front of us. Before it's too late, I'll see you in the next one.